University of Washington-Tacoma's Office for Equity and Inclusion launched a bias reporting tool in the fall of 2016. I've been meaning to talk about this for a long time. Here's the University of Washington-Tacoma's Equity and Inclusion website. As you can see, you can go to report a bias. There's a bunch of information. And a bias report form. And there you have it. Bias reporting is for reporting so-called bias incidents. According to the university's bias reporting page, a bias incident is an action or behavior motivated by the offender's bias against any identity, including but not limited to age, ancestry, color, gender identity, race, national origin, or combination thereof. Most responses a bias report might trigger are focused on the alleged victim, including offers of support in the form of counseling. However, it could also involve removing flyers, calling for educational workshops and seminars, or triggering potentially punitive processes outlined under other UW policies. If the report falls outside of these offenses and processes, the report will move to the Bias Incident Review Committee. This committee will come up with a remedy grounded in ideas of restorative justice, with the goal of growing the university community's understanding of and embracing equity issues. Bias reporting is one of the reasons why the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education, that is FIRE, gives the university a rating of yellow for having at least one ambiguous policy prone to allow abuse and arbitrary application. There is a link to FIRE in the video description. I think skepticism, even alarm regarding the intentions of bias reporting is warranted. This is because of the way terms like equity, bias, and restorative justice are tossed around. Equity, in this context, refers to ensuring equal outcomes across identity groups rather than equality of opportunity. On the progressive view of things, equity is the principal demand of justice and so of all politics. When outcomes differ between identity groups, the situation is deemed unjust and attributed to racism, sexism, homophobia, and so on. This is so even when equal opportunity exists, and when we can point to other factors correlated with disparate outcomes like growing up without a father and the degree to which education was valued in a child's home. Given the connection between equity and terms like racism, equity is closely linked with other leftist buzzwords like diversity and inclusion. Certainly, there are differences in outcome that are attributable to rank prejudice and supremacism. That is what most people mean by racism, sexism, and homophobia. But prejudice is not always the culprit. For example, men on the whole make more money than women on the whole. Much of this is due to the different choices men and women make, and income differences largely evaporate when we compare like to like. Taking one small piece of this, though women earn more PhDs than men and outnumber men in graduate school, men earn overwhelmingly more PhDs in higher-earning STEM fields. Women also gravitate toward more flexible and lower-paying work arrangements, especially after they have children. One might say that divided labor in the family is sexist in this respect, or that women are conditioned to make decisions in sexist ways. But, without additional argument, either is just to define any differential outcome as sexist right out of the gate, which to my eyes looks question-begging. At the University of Washington, some demographic groups have higher acceptance and retention rates than others. In an October 11, 2016 email, and almost certainly in reference to this fact, Chancellor Pagano hit the social justice high note when he described the university as an institution pervaded by racism. However, it's not obvious that the disparities, which do not always favor white students by the way, are attributable to racism. The fact that students of East Asian descent outperform whites from admissions rates relative to representation in the population onwards suggests that explanations for differing outcomes other than racism are in order. My point is that the equity view of things is highly contestable, yet it is to equity and other progressive ideas that the university has committed itself. Because of this commitment, and some further ideas I will touch on in a moment, equity, diversity, and inclusion do not refer to diversity of opinion insofar as that includes free speech-loving liberals, libertarians, or conservatives in vibrant fora of debate and truth-seeking. Bias is an interesting word because, though we often use it pejoratively, it is not always bad. For example, one might have a bias toward dating a certain type, or for certain foods. Some inoffensive biases might exclude whole classes of people from certain offices. For example, a Muslim student club might not allow non-Muslims to head it as president. A Christian student club might not allow non-Christians to head it as president, and so on. A public university even shows bias by offering only state residents in-state tuition. These biases are not irrational because they are consonant with the aims of such organizations. In its negative sense, bias indicates an unfair prejudice. Thus, one might be biased toward women in criminal sentencing, against libertarians, or toward only putting strong papers favoring progressive views on the course syllabus. Such biases will typically overlook individual features of a person, situation, or argument in favor of one's preconceptions. For example, I was once accused of being a white male for my advancing a libertarian argument on some issue. I forget what it was. This was not so much bias against white men as it was bias against libertarianism. The content of my argument didn't matter. Advancing it in the first place was seen as a manifestation of privilege that could be leveraged against the non-privileged. It was, in other words, perceived as a tool of oppression. There are those who think that arguing that the University of Washington is not a racist white supremacist institution, or that there are only two genders and these are tied to biological sex, or that sexism doesn't stand behind the so-called gender wage gap, are assaults on the human dignity of blacks, transgendered people, and women, respectively. Such arguments emerge from the ideas of privilege and equity. Some, it is said, benefit from patriarchal cis-heteronormative white supremacy, which is said to characterize Western civilization, and some do not. Those who benefit are not threatened by argument. Those lower on the identity dominance hierarchy are threatened, thus forwarding arguments that challenge the way some conceive of themselves and their situation is seen as a form of oppression and violence. This extends what can be represented as moral offense, harm, and yes, as a bias incident. I'm not making this up. John Patrick Leary, an English professor at Wayne State University, argued like this in defense of the Middlebury protesters who turned out to no-platform Charles Murray a while back. You can link to Professor Leary's screed in the video description. At any rate, the university tells us, bias-related conduct is behavior that by intent, action, and/or outcome may offend, harm, or threaten to harm a person or group. Since intent, action, and outcome are joined in a disjunction, actual intent does not really come into a bias incident. And as most people understand prejudice, prejudice won't come into it either. And we've seen what's been done to the term harm. Consider that a Regent's file from June 2016 reports the need to support students who have experienced so-called microaggressions, which we know do not require intent of any kind. If the University of California system is any indication, microaggressions include declaring that America is the land of opportunity and saying that the most qualified person should get the job. Either could be an example of verbal bias, and, as I've suggested, even arguing your case could be seen as privileged, and so as an offense. We should be on the lookout. Under the progressive equity rubric, the meanings of harm, threaten, and offend have been widely extended, and, I suggest, in a way that is stacked against those on the right. Restorative justice usually indicates a system of criminal justice focused both on rehabilitating offenders and reconciling them to their victims and communities. This might involve restitution and other measures meant to restore what an offense destroyed. However, in the university context, so-called bias that does not rise to the level of a prescribed offense will be treated with the tools of restorative justice. These tools presuppose that an offense has occurred and that it has objective moral features as a wrong. All that is required is the perception of harm. Bias offenders might then be asked to go to education seminars. These may be imposed on the community if bias trends are identified. I'm reminded of Herbert Morris's description of the therapy system in his well-known essay, Persons and Punishment. Therein, Morris points out that the alleged offender's objections under a therapeutic corrective model are taken as further evidence of malignancy to be cured. In this case, dissent could well be seen as evidence of further bias. Besides, you might be asked, how could you oppose anti-bias training in the first place? What are you, a bigot? The potential for arbitrary application and abuse is high. Restorative justice will be triggered in the absence of clearly defined offenses and in disputed moral territory. It is in this disputed moral territory that Bias Incident Review Committee busybodies will impose their moral and political views on those who dissent by labeling their dissent bias. Of course, one might object that bias against conservative understandings of the world is just like bias against non-Christians as president of the Christian Club. The university has, after all, adopted progressive social justice values. Conservatives can shape up or ship out. But it's not clear that institutional promotion and enforcement of progressive social justice values is appropriate for a public university, nor is it clear that those values are compatible with pursuing truth, which, one might think, is an indispensable function of universities. Attempts to know platform speakers for the reasoned arguments they will give, alongside toothless administrative action and sometimes complicity, suggests that progressive social justice values and the pursuit of truth through vibrant debate are not compatible at any rate. Thus, I remain deeply suspicious of the bias reporting tool since I suspect that it's an outgrowth of a political movement that is at its core antagonistic to the ideas of free speech-loving lefties and the ideas of libertarians and conservatives. The term bias is therefore likely to be used in ways that are themselves biased in the negative sense, and oriented toward thought policing. The fire rating yellow is certainly justified. If you liked this video, if it raised questions or otherwise made you think, click like, comment, and subscribe. If you think I missed something, or if you hated it, I encourage you to comment.